tier 2 boots balance. Any thoughts on why Boots of Swiftness receive smaller nerfs? I think one thing you have to think about with a boot like Boots of Swiftness is it's somewhat binary in what it gives compared to the other boots. It's like, the other boots, it's like Sork shoes, right? Sork shoes are like, hey, I give Magic Pen. And we can adjust that Magic Pen number to be mostly whatever we want. Obviously, there's a number that's too low. And it's still, at the end of the day, the Magic Pen boot that competes the other boots by doing Magic Pen, right? The thing about Boots of Swiftness is Boots of Swiftness, what they give is more movement speed. They also give the slow resist, but like, you know, you're buying them for that combined effect of more movement speed. And if they're not giving enough more movement speed than the other boots, then they don't really fulfill their purpose as like, these are the boots that give more movement speed. And so it's a thing where it's that number, that movement speed number on Boots of Swiftness is not as malleable at the bottom end as the other numbers. Meaning that like there's some minimum value where after we go below that, if we go below that value, it's like, why are you buying these boots? What's the point? They aren't giving you enough of a differential versus the other boots to like be worth it. And so that's the thing that is complicated about those boots, I would say. Doesn't mean that they can't be adjusted or nerfed if we ever need to, right? Like one of the ways we can do it is price, right? It's right now they're, 700 and maybe they're supposed to be 800 if they're strong or things like that. But if we compare them to the the other boots, they have basically a minimum amount of power in their movement speed they need to have to make sense. And then in regards to the slow resist, that also has a thing of like, well, you could say, well, hey, what if you wanted to nerf the slow resist? And I'm not saying we couldn't, right? Like maybe that's a way to nerf them if we needed to. But there's also a minimum amount of slow resistance that like once you get below it, you're like, these aren't really fulfilling their purpose of slow resisting boots either, right? So basically noting that Swiftness boots, I'd say, to make them viable or purchasable at all, probably have tighter restrictions on the minimum values for that slow resist and that move speed. Are they in a perfect balance spot right now, though? I couldn't tell you. It sounds like some people think they're strong, which they very well could be. Another note about Boots of Swiftness that I think is important to note is sometimes people will like list their win rates in terms of like, oh, Boots of Swiftness wins this much more than other boots on a character. Like, let's go look at, say, I don't know, who's a good example of what I'm talking about right here. I'm trying to think of someone who's like these things aren't core on. Let's go find it so I can talk to you about some items. Okay, so let's take a look at Darius, right? This is Darius, Emerald Plus. Let's go to all ranks just to get a higher sample size. We're going to look at his boots purchases. And you'll notice something here. You'll notice that Boots of Swiftness are a lot stronger by raw win rate than these other two boot options, right? The Dariuses who buy Boots of Swiftness tend to win a lot more games than the Dariuses who are buying the other boots. And so one of the things you can look at when you look at this and be like, oh, Boots of Swiftness, clearly overpowered, right? Like, what's going on here? But one of the things you have to note about these win rate differentials is Boots of Swiftness are also a more situational buy. And Boots of Swiftness are also a boot you're more likely to buy in situations where like you can give up the defense of Steel Caps or Merc Treads. And in situations where you can give up the defense of these items as a character like Darius, that is likely to be a situation where you're already doing well or already likely to succeed in that game. And so that's the complication with just raw win rate comparisons for these items, is Boots of Swiftness are likely on a lot of melee characters to look like the higher win rate option, given that they tend to be purchased in moments where you're succeeding already, compared to other characters. Anyways, I'm not saying they're perfectly balanced. I think a really decent observation is like, hey, a lot of boots, got weaker over time, and Swiftness got less weaker. And so maybe in the long run, compared to some of these other ones, they might be, fairly strong. But it's hard to do a direct win rate comparison on them because of that snowbally nature that they may have when they're purchased, and the situations in which they're purchased. And so that's something you have to think about. Who's another good example to talk about here? And the other thing you want to think about too in terms of the boots, right, is like what that boot is adding in terms of diversity for like boots in the roster. So like as an example right here, it's like boots of Swiftness seem good on Darius. Like I'm not going to say these things are bad or weak on Darius. Like clearly they're good on Darius in some number of games, right? And like that's valuable to have a like more aggressive boot option for a character like Darius. Same thing with like characters like Soraka. A lot of supports sometimes, I don't know if it's still the case nowadays depending on lucidity, but a character like Soraka, like having an option to go Swiftness some games on supports is pretty good. And so she's usually going lucidity boots, but every once in a while she picks up Swifties, right? And so that's another thing too when you think about like, okay, well, if boots of Swiftness are good, should we nerf them, right? Like one of the things is how often they're appearing, on who, how overwhelming they are to choice in these systems, and then also you don't want to be in a situation where because they look good when they're purchased some amount of the time on a character like Soraka or Darius, just immediately nerfing them down because then like maybe they get purchased none amount of the time, or zero amount of the time on a character like Darius or Soraka, and like that's sad. Now again, I'm not. There's some characters who like probably purchase these most of the time, like Janna loves these things, right? Which makes sense given who she is. And I'm assuming there's a lot of Garen Swiftie enjoyers out there. Yep, Swiftness is pretty decent on Garen, although he really likes attack speed boots as well. And then, like, I think Kale swapped over to them over the time. She's a Swiftie enjoyer, yeah. So yeah, if I was like, look at all these things, I would definitely like make the conclusion that Swiftness are strong. But they're a boot that has a very specific niche in the game. And when it's fulfilling that niche, they probably look fairly decent, and they probably look like decent choices on a lot of characters. So there's always a question of like, is it a decent choice? Is it OP? Is it overwhelming the choice system? If you nerf it, do you get into a spot where people just don't have that option? Right, there's a lot of considerations to talk about there.